The koala, a cuddly, furry, perfect citizen who kills nothing, does no damage, and gets in no one's way. Yet this cherished emblem of Australia is slowly disappearing, its forests destroyed and its population dwindling. But Deborah Tabart and Steve Phillips are Aussie greenies, passionate about making sure their country's life symbol remains very much alive and kicking. For over 40 million years, life in Australia has evolved in exotic ways. As the island continent slowly drifted towards the equator, its lush rainforests dried into vast groves of eucalyptus trees. Many animals, from possums to parrots, made these forests their home. Through the ages, the koala evolved with the gum tree and made it its bedroom, its kitchen, and its coliseum. The first surprise about koalas is that they're not bears, they're marsupials, born just 35 days after conception. The tiny baby, or joey, is barely the size of a cashew and weighs less than a gram. For 6 months or so, its mother's pouch provides all the creature comforts, milk, warmth, and the perfect place to hide. But when Mother Nature designed this safe nursery, she didn't reckon on the human factor. 200 years ago, European settlers brought civilization to the outback. Immense forests were demolished, and in the pockets of habitat that survived, koalas were slaughtered for the international fur trade. During the 1920s, more than 3 million were killed, leaving them extinct in many places, critically threatened in others. Today, koalas are protected, but there's no legislation safeguarding their forest homes. Fewer than 100,000 remain, and their numbers continue to fall. Modern perils like cars and dogs kill about 4,000 every year. Many others die from brush fires and ruined habitat. If there are still any wild koalas in 50 years, it will be partly because of work done in this Brisbane office. The Australian Koala Foundation is busy fighting on 2 fronts: studying koalas and their habitat and wrestling with government and developers. Their fearless leader is Deborah Tabart, who would seem more at home in a boardroom than in the bush. Yet behind the designer chic lies a deep commitment to the wild.
Well, as cute and cuddly as she might look, our major focus really now is her trees. And unless we really put all our energies into protecting this animal's habitat, then she will have nowhere to sit and nowhere to eat and nowhere to live.
The AKF's secret weapon is biologist Steve Phillips. He knows as much about koalas as anyone on Earth. The more he discovers about the creatures he loves, the more concerned he becomes for their survival.
The koala I guess, has the advantage of being so globally well loved, and yet it's in a great deal of trouble. And if we can't save this animal, then we ain't going to save nothing.
Together, Steve and Deborah make a tough team, combining his scientific expertise with her business skills and political savvy. In a country where conservation can be a dirty word, the koala needs all the help they can offer. The koala's world is the eucalyptus tree, and they've evolved many adaptations to life in its branches and leaves. Unlike other tree-dwelling mammals, they have no tail. Koalas are the big shots up here, so they get along fine without aerial acrobatics. With strong limbs and powerful claws, the koala is an adept climber. Each hand has 5 digits, including 2 opposable thumbs for an iron grip. The distinctive fur that made koalas the target of hunters is one of the best insulating coats of any animal in the world. Without nests or caves, koalas depend on their fur to endure the elements. The koala has a clever way to avoid competing with other animals for food. The eucalyptus leaves it loves are highly poisonous to most creatures. For koalas, however, these toxic morsels are the stuff of life. Koalas are extremely picky eaters. Only a few types of eucalyptus are acceptable, and every leaf gets the once-over. Teeth are beautifully adapted for nipping the fibrous leaves and crushing them to a fine pulp. Like many marsupials, koalas are nocturnal. Their sensitive hearing and finely tuned sense of smell help them through the forest night. Whether they can survive the challenges we put in their way remains to be seen. Koalas live life in the slow lane. Their eucalyptus diet is high in fiber and low in nutrition, so they need plenty of downtime just for digestion. They spend 18 to 20 hours each day resting and divide the remaining time between feeding, moving around, and socializing. It's not a lifestyle that will get on the highlight reel of nature's wildest moments, but for those who understand them, koalas can be truly amazing.
These are incredibly complex animals. You know, they live their lives in a very complex matrix of overlapping home range areas. There are dominance hierarchies. There sort of looks like there's care for the aged. The sort of tragedy for us is that we're only just beginning to understand the sort of complexities that make these animals tick. And it's understanding those basic necessities of how animals live their lives and how they interact with each other that's actually fundamental to their conservation.
Steve has been studying koalas for 20 years, using radio collars to track their movements. In piecing together a picture of their social life, his discoveries have transformed everything we know about koalas and revolutionized the fight to conserve them. By mapping the activity of individuals over several years, Steve discovered that koalas have an elaborate social system with clearly defined rules over where they go and how they interact.
What the radio tracking work really consolidated for us was just how complex koala society is. They're not what people think they are. They're not these cute little fluffy grey things that just wander aimlessly around in the forest. They live in a highly ordered and structured society with well-defined boundaries, interactions between males. They're just so fascinating.
Each community is centered on an alpha male, a sort of big daddy whose call can be heard a kilometer away.
In the springtime when the alpha calling the females, and they come and they mate with him, and they'll travel many kilometres to do that. It's the preferential mating that goes on, this selection by the females of the dominant male. It's his genes they want. They know that his input will give them a joey with the best chance of survival.
Males can also initiate courtship, and they take the lead in the mating dance. After successful coupling, a little boasting is in order. Koala society is territorial. Every animal has somewhere it calls home, and disputes over real estate are common.
You see this sort of shadowing behaviour as these subordinate males come up to the alpha male and they want to get close and they want to have a shot at him, but he's just so big. And all he has to do is go, boo, and they run away. And they'll come back and try again another day. It's the role that the alpha male plays in protecting the key food resource on this site, and that his status and his worth is measured by the number of trees he controls.
Male koalas stake out their territory with distinctive scent. A special gland on their chest secretes a pungent oil, a kind of koala calling card, left behind to claim ownership over a particular tree or area. Trespassers may be prosecuted, and when koalas get tough, the fur starts to fly. The winner makes sure his triumph gets a little publicity. Beyond the rough stuff, though, koalas coexist in remarkably peaceful communities.
There's an essence and an element of compassion in koala society, much of which should really be mirrored in our own society. It's the care that the females show to their joeys. It's the respect that they have for the older members of their society. The old males who may have, maybe sometime in their past, been a dominant male on this site, but have now just been relegated to senior citizen status. They're allowed to live with the breeding females. The dominant male tolerates him as well, and he's just allowed to live his life out, and it's the way that they live their lives.
Each koala has its favourite hangouts. Steve has gradually learned how to understand the language of these home-range trees, and they read like a who's who of koala society.
I know this tree is really fascinating because it can tell us a great deal about these animals and how they're living their lives on this site. As you look at the bark, you can see it's interlaced with lots of fresh scratch marks, and they're covering over scratch marks that are several years old. And it's a tree that's been used by male and female koalas over successive generations. You take these sort of trees out and your population collapses. It just helps them. It's like the fences in our own backyards. These are the battlegrounds, the boudoirs and the boundaries of koala society. And when they're gone, the koalas go to, because they have no sense of where they are.
While rearing their young, mother koalas continue roaming throughout their home range. To survive, joeys must perfect the art of hugging. Eventually, the youngster starts to explore a little and to complement his diet of mother's milk with the leaves that will sustain him through his life. But with each small step towards independence, the joey enters a world that's less and less secure. As Australia's economy expands, the destruction of the koala's precious eucalyptus trees is relentless. For a long time, it was thought that displaced koalas could simply move to other trees and carry on with their lives. Steve's research showed otherwise.
All of a sudden you can start to see the reasons why much of the habitat that remains in Australia is now empty and the forests are going quiet, because we've done exactly what these animals don't want us to do. We've taken out their key food resource, we've removed their home range trees, and we've destroyed their social boundaries, and they become nutritionally stressed, and they usually get diseased, and eventually they die.
80% of Australia's koalas live on private land, so we have to encourage every landholder in this country that has this magnificent creature on its property to say, I am prepared to make concessions. We cannot afford to just continue to have them eaten by dogs, run over by cars, and think there's plenty more.
We're trying to tell people you've got to take some action, you've got to do something, but the apathy in society and the apathy in bureaucracy sort of says, oh, you know, we'll think about it, and we don't know that you're right yet. And we can see the future looming larger and larger now, and it's this inaction that's going to be partly responsible for the loss of the animal through most of its remaining habitat.
Nevertheless, like most Aussies, koalas seem to like to party, and distance is no obstacle when it comes to finding good company.
It's not so much the presence of preferred food trees that dictates the movements of koalas, it's the presence of other koalas. So where you have a resident breeding population, that population acts like a magnet, and koalas will travel miles to get to it, and they'll sort of, as they crisscross the countryside looking for somewhere to live, they'll be more interested in living where there's an aggregation already established than they are in living in an area with beautiful food trees in it.
Despite the crash in their numbers, koalas are a familiar sight to many Australians. At popular resorts like Noosa, prime habitat also happens to be pricey real estate. Although tourists and local residents see koalas all the time, it's a deceptive image. The same few animals keep popping up in different places, and the crisis goes unnoticed.
The need is not just to preserve intact the remaining breeding aggregations, it's to facilitate the exchange of genetic information from one aggregation to another. And when aggregations are many kilometres apart and in the middle is a network of roads and highways and towns and villages and dogs and cars, the odds are not very good that these animals are going to make it through.
The Australian Koala Foundation is marching into battle, mapping where koalas live. When finished, their Koala Habitat Atlas will be the most exhaustive inventory of wildlife homeland ever compiled.
This is brush box, the Boston convertus.
It's also the single most powerful weapon in the conservation arsenal. Every eucalyptus is recorded and examined with details about its size and species carefully logged. Scratches on bark and droppings on the ground proclaim that this tree is indeed being used by koalas. Back at the AKF office, all the field notes are entered into a computer. When sifted, sorted and analysed, the result is colour-coded maps showing exactly which trees are essential.
The Koala Habitat Atlas is incredibly important. It means that I can go in and sit in front of a town planner and say, this is koala habitat and these are the bits that are important, and you have to put legislation over on top of it. And if you don't do that, you will not have this animal at some stage in the future.
So far, AKF has surveyed some 60,000 trees on over 600 sites. But merely knowing which trees must be saved may not be enough.
There is not a population that we've assessed at this stage that is not endangered, and that becomes frightening. And when you realise that some of the local government decision makers and the bureaucrats who are going to read these documents and think, oh gee, you know, if we enact these decisions, some of our friends are going to be very upset. You know, I say, damn you, these animals haven't got enough time. And if someone doesn't take hard action quickly, they'll lose them.
Near the border between New South Wales and Queensland, the AKF is putting their atlas to the test. In the very forests where Steve conducted his pioneering research, a massive housing estate is under construction. The original plans would have wiped out every koala in the area. the AKF jumped into action. Armed with the Habitat Atlas, Deborah met repeatedly with the housing project's developer and eventually brokered an innovative marriage between development and conservation.
What he just wanted to do was put a road straight through here, clear this out of the way, and plant a few trees down here. Now, this particular animal, a female, Lulu we called her, she had a dependent young that she was feeding. And clearly, this piece of habitat was critical for her. So in arguing with the developer, we managed to get him to leave this bit of vegetation for Lulu, and not only that, but to construct a road around the edges of her home range so that her habitat was kept intact.
Residents of Koala Beach like it that way. In exchange for having no dogs and driving over speed bumps, they get koalas in their backyard and a clean conscience. The koalas get a conditional reprieve. The battle here was even waged over individual trees. Steve knew that this particular eucalyptus was a favorite of an old koala named 501. It took a major skirmish to save the tree from the bulldozers, and even then, Steve wasn't sure if it was still being used.
These are old 501's very distinctive fecal pellet. His age is so great that he can no longer sort of really break down his food material properly, and so there tends to be long fibrous strands going through him, and his pellets sort of characterise themselves with a piggy tail spiral at the end, and that's his distinctive trademark. So where we find these, we know that
he's using it.
He's using it. This is really good to see.
Whether 501 appreciates all the effort to save his tree is unlikely, but for Steve and Deb, his precious pellets suggest that the experiment at Koala Beach may actually work. And it's exactly this kind of deal, a compromise between the needs of people and the requirements of koalas, that offers hope for the future.
When you work for an organisation like the AKF and you're fortunate enough to work on an animal like this, you know that sort of out there sort of raising money for you are little kids, you know, and families, and their message is very simple, it's save the koala. And so it's a great honour to be able to sort of work for that sort of commitment, you know, and I know that from my perspective, you know, I'm certainly going to make sure they get their money's worth.
Our little Joey is now a year old. Soon he'll venture off to join a breeding aggregation of his own. His success and the fate of his species may depend on us and our willingness to save him a place in the wild.